Today we're going to be looking at 7 more free horror games. Once again, some of these are recent games from itch.io and Steam, and others are relics from the internet. There will be links to all of them in the description. Most of these are very short, with the longest being around 40 minutes this time. First up is an incident at Grove Lake, which follows someone as they examine some tapes that allow the player to relive the events at Grove Lake, and what slowly unravels is a sinister alien abduction. The game's atmosphere is of tension and paranoia, and it feels like a grand conspiracy is taking place. You're somewhere you clearly shouldn't be, and as the game progresses, the feeling of apprehension just keeps rising and rising. It uses a lot of establishing shots in a cinematic way, and it's honestly really engaging to see. The game's scares are limited to a few brief moments, with most of it taking place in cutscenes and a few jump scares. But the horrifying and cruel way the alien powers are presented is haunting. The sound design is mostly covered in tape hiss, but uses a lot of standard sound effects as well as radio chatter. There's no voice acting for the in-game characters either. Some of the sound environment is a little off, but otherwise it's fine. The game's gore is pretty vague, with a lot of things happening on board the alien ship, but it's more weird and disturbing than straight up gory. The story is half government conspiracy and half reliving the alien abduction, and it's pretty entertaining for the most part, but it ends with a real life phone call to a real talk show that existed in the 90s, and plays a clip where a man talks about his time in Area 51 in an incredibly distressed tone.
Online, you're on the air. Hello.
Hello, Art.
Yes.
Hi. I don't have a whole lot of time.
Well, look, let's begin by finding out whether you're using this line properly or not.
Area 51.
Yeah, that's right. Were you an employee or are you now?
A former employee.
Former employee.
I was let go on a medical discharge about a week ago.
It's probably the most towering part of the game, but sadly it's hard to give it credit for it since it's an audio clip that already exists. The game is about 20 minutes long. Next up is Night People, which follows someone as they attempt to reclaim money left behind in a haunted building. The game's atmosphere is pretty intense from the get-go, with an ominous soundtrack and dark, foreboding corridors. The single light bulb swings backward and forth, and the hallways are all narrow and claustrophobic. The game's scares are mostly jump scares and a chase sequence. The jump scares come across as pretty cheap and are rarely effective, and the chase sequence has several problems with it being unclear which way to go to survive, and the general threat of the dogs chasing you is they're just not threatening, which leads to the chase sequence being annoying rather than frightening. The game had 1 or 2 frightening moments, but it didn't really feel like a lot of thought went into most of them. The sound design was a bit lackluster, with really nice atmospheric soundtracks, but sound effects that stood out as awkward with them not really feeling part of the environment. There wasn't any directional audio either, which just made things more awkward. Sound effects would seemingly cut off too early or just be too loud on top of all this. The gore was bizarre and unexpected, but made very little sense story-wise. The story follows a fortune seeker as they explore an abandoned house to reclaim money that was taken into a place and then lost. There's some wanted posters and other things left inside the house in odd places, which is a bit weird, but it's nice to have a backstory to the game regardless. The game is about 10 minutes long. Kraven Manor is a classic horror adventure about someone arriving at the eponymous Kraven Manor and exploring its mysterious insides. The manor itself is grand and ominous, but some parts are definitely creepier than others, with places like the basement giving off dread as you explore them. The puzzles too are very life and death and add a ton of pressure as you rush to solve them. The game's scares boil down to scripted events, jump scares, and some more interesting encounters like the library when the mannequin antagonist only moves when you aren't looking at it and makes violin-style scraping sounds to signal that it's moving. This is still really effective. The scripted events are sometimes pretty great, but some of them have the habit of locking the camera and player in place and zooming in on something, and it takes away from the moment. The sound design is great with loads of tension pieces, some generic but well-used sound effects, and an unforgettable violin scraping that you come to associate with fear. Some of the action music near the end is a bit generic too, but it's far from bad. There's some dark streaks of blood in the game, but that's really as far as the gore goes, which is fine. The story is told through ominous items you find, as well as themes alluding to other things, like finding a copy of the book Paradise Lost and seeing photos of some kind of ritual, as well as the existence of the mannequin. It does let you piece a lot of the story together on your own. The game builds up to a final boss battle, which was pretty surprising. Kraven Manor is about 30 to 40 minutes long, depending on how much you explore. How Fish is Made is a bizarre horror game where you play as a fish that's fallen down a tube and entered a surreal place. The game's tone is strange, with fish questioning you on what you believe in, whether to go up or down, without providing context for what it even means. The game feels dreamlike, and you're stuck in this impossible to gauge quandary, up or down, and everyone has an opinion for it, but no one wants to say what it means. The game doesn't have any scares, but has a ton of disturbing imagery, but it directly contradicts itself with a dance song in the middle of the game, told by a parasite living in a creature's mouth, which, whilst funny in some scenes, is disturbing in a lot of other ways too. The sound design is pretty sparse, with only slow, menacing tones to fill in the gaps between the sound of the fish flopping around. There's gore from a perspective of a fish, with a lot of fish corpses scattered throughout the game, discarded casually or dead in frankly saddening environments. The story is deliberately opaque, up or down. What does it mean? Everyone wants to know, and it feels like a divine question, with many seemingly profound words and gestures that lead to something unclear. Many try to sway your decision and use some facts and logic to make you change your mind, and the ending is so ambiguous that it often feels like there was never a choice at all. I chose up. The game is about 20 minutes long. Westwich Castle is a very familiar looking game that follows an unnamed protagonist as they explore Westwich Castle. The game's atmosphere uses large, ominous corridors and strangely quiet environments to build up tension agonizingly slowly. Anticipation grows as you keep going deeper into the various rooms, expecting something to happen. The game pays off that tension with some chase sequences with a monster, but between the nauseating screen effects and how unbelievably far the monster chases the player, I died nearly every time it chased me. After this, the monster doesn't respawn and just you can wander around the area threat-free. This kind of kills the horror and turns a lot of the enemy encounters into an annoying sequence that I personally was never able to get out of. The sound design was very minimal, with bare-bones sound effects that worked really well to keep the game tense, but the sound of the monster chasing sound was grating and made running away from monsters even less enjoyable. The game's gore was presented with low-quality mangled corpses, but it made discovering bodies with the lantern really disturbing. The gore was surprisingly good. The story talks about the creation of monsters in some diary entries, and it's quite well written stuff detailing events, but the game's ending is really sudden and feels like there should have been more. Westwich Castle is about 25 to 30 minutes long. Baldi's Basics is a pseudo-edutainment horror game where the game's mascot, Baldi, chases you around the school. The game's atmosphere is sickeningly realistic to legitimate 90s edutainment games, with bright colours and 2D sprites bouncing around the place. But after failing the impossible maths quiz, Baldi begins to follow you, and there's a sense of desperation in the air to avoid him catching you. The game's scares come from the constant chasing, as well as the obstacles in your way that slow you down as he follows, the insidious smile you see when he hears you open a door, or the inevitable jump scare that comes if you fail to get away. The game uses a lot of tropes of 90s edutainment software with the MIDI instrument soundtrack, the compression crunch on Baldi's dialogue, and the sometimes distorted children's voices, but the sound is also a big deal in terms of gameplay, with you being able to identify how far Baldi is behind you with the sound of him slapping the ruler against his hand. There's no gore in the game, and it didn't really need any, and the game's story is limited, but it's not one that really needs a backstory to be weird and frightening. Finally, we have No Players Online, which is a pseudo-online multiplayer game where you're taken into a match of capture the flag against seemingly no one. The environment is very reminiscent of the 90s again, and when you start seeing apparitions of a ghostly player, things really start getting far more intense very quickly. The game transitions to you feeling hunted by this black shadow that keeps appearing in front of you, and these terrifying scripted events. The game's soundtrack is spacey and weird, with the sound of old jazz music playing lopsided melodies until you destroy the record player, while it's replaced with this electrifying ambience. The sound effects are all classic with the muffled compression to them. There's no gore in the game, and the story only really gets going around halfway through when the game developer joins the game and talks to you about how the ghost is related to them, and it reads like a creepypasta, but it does a pretty decent job of making the game more harrowing. It's difficult not to feel a sense of pity and revulsion for the developer, since what they're doing feels so unnatural. The game is around 10 minutes long. And that's it for this roundup. I've got a lot of these to get through, and we'll hopefully have some more to show you soonish. Thanks for watching, and always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace.